My name is Molly Murphy Adams, and I am originally from Western Montana in Missoula, went to high school and college in Missoula, Montana, and now I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma with my husband, and still come back home for a lot of events. In general, the space between, for me, the idea for the title of the exhibition, The Space Between, was about exploring and really sort of zooming in on beadwork and examining it both historically and philosophically and visually, and trying to really understand the components of that. One of the things that I was doing simultaneously with this exhibition is also pursuing a master's in art history, and part of that has been to both reclaim and re-examine historic beadwork through an art history lens, whereas historically it has always been examined and understood through an anthropology lens. And that has failed in many, many ways. And one of the ways it's failed is that beadwork is almost never really truly visually analyzed for its own merits and qualities. It's just sort of categorized as beadwork, and never, the patterns aren't discussed, the changes in pattern, the meanings of pattern, and in there, lost in there, is all the personhoods of all the people that made that work. And that's in that. So for me, there's the space between disciplines of anthropology and art history that can be fruitful, and there's this space between historic and contemporary, and then there's the actual space between the designs and what they meant now and what they meant before. And so trying to sort of keep things sort of in comparison and in relationship to each other. So that was some of the thematic ideas behind my work in this show. I started to bead at 7 and started making all my own dance regalia when I was 13 and wanted to bead, but I really didn't have any conception until the last year of art school that I could combine those things and then turn it into something bigger. All of my work is ultimately derived from historic and traditional beadwork practices and forms, and both my own tribal background of Lakota beadwork, but also where I grew up in Western Montana with a lot of Salish influences on my beadwork as well. And so all of my work is trying to explore that historic beadwork tradition, and to try and sort of understand the elements and understand not just how that form looks or appears, but what the intent and original meaning is behind it, and how that meaning has been translated over time, and new meanings that we can apply with it, and new ways that we can tell stories that we are experiencing now through that other kind of medium. And because of my background of learning to be a beadworker before I learned to become an artist, for me, my work, especially getting a BFA at the U of M, that was a process of learning these Western art traditions and then taking and applying all of the things I learned in my community and putting it through and sort of blending those different priorities, traditions, practices, but ultimately taking all of those Western lenses and putting it through, those Western traditions, and putting it through the lens of my own aesthetic experience and historic experience. And what it came up with was telling stories one way or another through beadwork, whether it's with representational images, incorporating beadwork in printmaking. I use printmaking to illustrate or explore beadwork designs, and so using all these different mediums to ultimately try to tease out all the lessons I can from beadwork traditions. I have certain artists that I've always appreciated for different kinds of qualities and the way they make me think about what I'm doing. I'm a huge fan of Wayne Thiebaud's landscape paintings. Most people know his food, and those are very fun, but his landscape paintings are absolutely sublime. And they really also devalue the human perspective and change it in color. So I'm an absolute sucker for saturated color. And I didn't have a lot of mainstream art mentors or sort of heroes or role models because I couldn't see what I wanted to do and what they were doing. And so it took a while to try and find out how I was going to blend those two together. So a lot of times when I do have somebody that I admire, like Wayne Thiebaud, it's not necessarily everything, it's about color, or Wayne Thiebaud's repetition and compartmentalization, and or sometimes it's just like Albert's color theory. It's not necessarily work he makes, it's about the way that work makes me think and then respond to it. I did not think that art was a valid pursuit for a very poor kid with no prospects. So I was originally a hard science major and loved science, and still do and still follow that. But I finished my freshman year of college and then took some time off to try and figure out, if this isn't what I'm going to do, what am I going to do? And my first semester at the U of M in the art department was just kind of a placeholder, but then I fell in love with it and thought, well, I always knew I was kind of good at this, but maybe I could actually do this. Yeah. And then once I graduated with an art degree, I had my senior thesis book to travel, and my attitude, my declaration at the time was, I was a mom, I had commitments, was that I'm going to do this until the wheels fall off, and then I'm going to have to do something else. And so it's been 20 years and the wheels have not yet fallen off. With the photographs, I started originally using very traditional landscape photographs that are from a human perspective. And I liked that effect, but I found that there was something kind of missing in it. And then when I started working with my photographer friend, Leroy Graff, and he was doing this drone photography, and that for me clicked so solidly, because part of what I'm trying to do is to offer a different perspective on seeing the landscape. And so all the landscape, whether it's photography, painting and stuff, that centers the human perspective, that's literally about 5 to 6 feet off the ground, facing outward, looking at it, that sort of tells the viewer all the time that the most important way of viewing this is from this human perspective. And we don't view it from the ground level, but also, you know, we're saying that the human perspective is the most important perspective. And so the drone photographs also, I thought, helped me take it to the second level of decentering the person in this, which is what most Indigenous abstract design is doing, is saying that rather than an accurate representation of something, what's more important is representing its qualities, or how you interact with it, or what it means, rather than this is what it looks like, because that's a very flat perspective on something. And so to get above it from that bird's eye view, and it was one of the pieces that I did about powwow grand entry and how it's viewed from above, and about how everybody in that grand entry is making a larger design that nobody can see. And so that's a sister piece that's in the Yellowstone Art Museum. The Missoula Art Museum is a map piece, and then the sister piece is a representation of a grand entry snake dance that is at Arlie Celebration every 4th of July. So trying to say that part of the abstract designs in Native traditions are about qualities, and those qualities necessarily are not only important when they're perceived by people. That something exists without your witnessing it, and is valid even if you can't witness it, and that there's another element to landscape photography and painting that is about consuming it and making it consumable from that eye vantage point, and kind of changing it so that it's not about how we consume it, but about, you know, how it might really appear to most of the beings that live there. And I thought, especially with the photography series that with drones that showcased water erosion, and there's one piece that contrasts patterns of water erosion versus roads in the landscape, and how one of them is sort of seamless and integrated, and one of them is an interruption. They're both there, and they're both patterns, and they're both very much in that landscape now, but how does that road look from an aerial perspective rather than how we view it and see it? When we're in it, we feel like we're in a seamless landscape, but it's not at all. It's a transected landscape. A lot of my research actually gets mixed in with other research, because I'm also a historian and art appraiser and consultant with museums. So my research feels like it's sort of eternal and ongoing. But there are times where I'm doing specific work for a very specific project. The works in this show are not necessarily as historically based as some of my other work, or as narrative based. With the photography works, I don't take the photos in these, and that's a bit of restraint, because these are the first works I've ever not done every single portion of the process. Whether it's painting or printmaking, that's always been my hand in it. But in this time, I worked with a photographer, and I worked with a couple of photographers, but they would take the photos and then I would pick, edit, process, print, and then take it from there. So they do take the original photos, and I've had to learn to try and describe what it is I'm looking for and look through maybe some of their existing and say I'd like some landscape like this. And the idea behind the photography was that I'm trying with the photographic pieces, I'm trying to find a way to help the audience visually link a culture from a landscape and the landscape itself. And to do that, I think utilizing a really known medium of landscape photography is a way to bridge that understanding of how important the landscape is in these abstracted designs that I'm working with. And I see landscape in those designs, but to try to help the audience bridge and go, these are not abstract thoughts maybe in the Western tradition. These are not abstracted feelings like we would see in abstract painting, but these are abstractions of a landscape and of a life lived on a landscape. And so I thought, if I can literally put it on a landscape, I can make that conversation start. And my other goal was to try to, with the landscape pieces, to try to really get the audience member to look at the designs as well. I found that audiences often struggle with beadwork because of the way it's been presented and talked about, that I genuinely have a really difficult time getting an audience to look at the designs. They look at maybe 4 pairs of beaded moccasins in a museum, and to them they all look exactly the same. Even if I were to say, well, one, the background is red and one is blue and one is white, they really almost can't see the difference. But if we were in a museum looking at paintings and one was white and one was red and one was blue, they would be able to see that. So there's something about how non-native people have been taught to view geometric designs as filler or background music, kind of elevator music, that makes it hard for them, even when they're trying, to see those designs and to see their parts. So in the photography, I thought, if I literally put it over a landscape photo, I can get them to see it. Like, I can grab their attention in a way that is known and familiar, and then superimpose this design over it and both help them to see the design, but also help them to see the connection between the design and the landscape. I would invite viewers to try to take the opportunity to really look at the geometric designs that are in here, not as background filler or mere decoration, but as symbols of really deep meaning and impact. And I've tried to present them in different ways that can kind of help reframe that to an audience that might not have real familial associations with them. So that's what I would invite, is to sort of, unfocus yourself and try to really look at these designs and not get too caught up in it, but let yourself imagine what these things can be and mean. I've added some other works that are focused on what we do to items, people, things, experiences when we put them under glass. So that's a specimen series, and that is using glass domes and cloches that also resemble vitrines, and kind of trying to critically examine both historic collecting and contemporary collecting, but also what happens when we take things out of context and how we change their meaning and our understanding. And that's sort of the space between the viewer and the things, and what happens when we have a lot of space between the viewer and the things, how that can change the purpose or the understanding of the object. And I found it's really fascinating when you put a glass cover on something, you change it completely. It loses a lot of its life, and its inherent freedom, even if it's a toy, is somehow gone. So we have this idea that we're protecting something, but it's hard to say are we protecting it? Are we isolating it? Are we preserving it? Are we stealing it? What is happening in that action? When I do historic research for my works, trying to sort of place my works in a lineage of beadworks. And so when I do historic research, I usually have to go to anthropology museums. So, one of the things that I've been experiencing is talking to people about how Native art has been studied and categorized and collected, and how that's different from Western art. And it's still is surprising to me, and it shouldn't be, but it is surprising to me how surprising that history is to non-Native audiences. That they it's not that they didn't know it. Some don't know it. Some have never been told that Native art is not in museums, in art museums. I've been doing a lot of work lately in Chicago, and there's the Field Museum, is an anthropology museum. And right next door is the Art Institute. And there's so little Indigenous art at the Art Institute, but there are no paintings at the Field Museum in anthropology. And so Impressionism is not a part of the story of humankind. It's an art story. It's not in the Field Museum. They're not interested in the story of how human beings started to think about art in the Western world differently in the 19th century and apply some ideas about both memory and feeling and stuff to Impressionism. They're not, for some reason, although actually they should be. They should be telling that as a development in humankind, but they're not. That's a development in art. So if you want to learn about the development of Native art, you have to go to an anthropology museum. And taking my daughter there recently she was kind of stunned. Even though she had been there before, she said, it wasn't until I exited the Native exhibit into the dinosaur bones that I realized how unfair this is. It was like, I know it and you talk about it, but I exited the Native art, and a lot of which is made in the last 20 years. It's contemporary, it's now, it's living artists, and then I exited into dinosaur bones and minerals. And I was like, yeah, that pretty much sums up the relationship. And I'm not saying that those anthropology museums aren't doing good work. And I'm not even saying that those places aren't serving a really good purpose, but there are so few art historians that know about Native culture, and then there are so few anthropologists that know about art history, that there is this really big gap, this really big space between and how they think about it. And most people are unaware that the majority of curators of contemporary Native art in the United States are trained anthropologists. There's a curious way in which contemporary culture perpetuates this scenario, not by overt action, but with blinders, but with like sort of subtle detours. Like, it's not a forced intersection with a stop sign, it's a roundabout, and it just sort of gently rebounds you. And then you don't learn about those things. And I think people are coming to grips with that in a lot of ways, whether it's history, whether it's with murder, missing, and Indigenous women, and learning that our current police and social justice doesn't work very well, and trying to find out what the systemic reasons for that is, whether it's environmental and finding out why that doesn't work very well, or politics and finding out why, even if we've abolished some of these overt problems, why are there all still these subtle traffic signals that seem to divert us away from seeing things clearly and understanding the root of it. And so for me, the difference in way Native art is talked about is rooted in that anthropology, art history divide that happened a long time ago, and that we're still having to untangle bit by bit, like a big ball of yarn that kittens got into, and it's a very hard job to untangle that.